Now let's introduce our speakers from Rational 360. We have Chris Golden, Vice President of Digital, Hina Razak, Vice President of Digital, Bryce Ballard, Senior Director of Social Listening, and Khadija Butt, Director. I'll let each speaker introduce more about themselves. So let's start with Chris.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see people joining from all around the country for our webinar today. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Chris Golden. I'm a Vice President at Rational 360. Rational 360 is a strategic communications company. We're based in Washington, and we work with clients who come to us across sectors and across industries from all around the country. Really, the through line that brings all of our clients together is wanting to run and execute winning campaigns that have a quantifiable impact that we can measure and we can demonstrate. And we think of ourselves as being able to run a fully integrated campaign from start to end, meaning from the beginning of identifying what's the right message, who are the right messengers, and how do we deliver that message, all the way through to showing results, whether that's results in legislation or regulation, results in public opinion, or results in success measured in a digital context through conversions or signups or letters to Congress. My personal background is having worked in the digital advocacy space basically my entire career in both Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco, California. And I'm really interested in what moves a grassroots advocate to take action. And I think that central question is one that I hope that we get to explore a little bit in this webinar today, because it may be at the center of being able to identify how do you measure if a campaign is working. If you're able to have someone move based on a message in a campaign, it may show that that message, that campaign is working. So with that, Melissa, back to you.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to introduce themselves, or shall we just get started?
I can go next. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Hina Razak. I'm the Vice President here on the Rational 360 team. And my background is having nearly a decade of experience working in digital marketing campaigns, both at the grassroots level and also at grass tops level.
Hey everybody, my name is Bryce. I focus on something called social listening, which is really identifying media analytics, both in the social media ecosystem and the news media ecosystem, and trying to combine all those forces together to produce insights for our clients. So that can be done in a measure of different ways across like influencer analytics, across own content analytics, and then just looking at online discussion as a whole. So looking forward to touching on some of those points as it pertains to this like campaign level measurement. I'll pass it to Khadija.
Thanks, Bryce. And I'm Khadija Butt, Director of Rational 360, and I primarily focus on developing and managing comprehensive public affairs strategies for federal and state campaigns, earned media, and then third-party relationship management, and really helping to translate complex policy issues into any way that's easy to understand for lawmakers or regulators or other members of the media.
Great. Well, thank you all for the introductions. Much appreciated. As a reminder to our audience, please put your questions in the chat box on the right. And we had a few questions that were submitted in advance from our community group, Wonk Nation. So let's start there. Let's see. Molly, do you think you can put them into the... There we go. Thank you.
Oh, here we go.
So what are some of the best digital methods for measuring if an audience is responding to a campaign's messaging?
I can field this one. So there's really two ways to go about it, right? Just thinking about analysis in general, both like qualitative and quantitative. I think the best way to do it is really a combination of both. So starting first thinking about like the qualitative side, it's really like when we think about a general B2C communications campaign, like a good example is hashtag performance, right? Usually a communications campaign will have a hashtag involved, and then we can see online how many people are using that hashtag. That's a very simple form, but still kind of answers this type of question. But thinking about it more of a public affairs context, right? It's looking at overall phrases people use online. So oftentimes we will employ a pretty complex, what we call like a Boolean search string, or like a general query to try and uncover online conversation. So looking at various messages, how often are they being used, right? And so all of what I'm talking about right now is just purely volume-based. There's a number of different metrics out there and available to us on social media we can measure in an instant. So volume being one of them. Also engagement, right? How many unique authors are out there? How many influencers are kind of putting out this campaign messaging? All of that are all qualitative ways to try and identify if an audience is responding to a communications campaign. On the qualitative end, we can also look at sentiment analysis, right? I really love my job. I can just kind of scroll through social media all day and get a sense of some of these like key insights that way. And I think that's almost equally as powerful. So learning how users are actually responding to social media online. So both by balancing the quantitative and the qualitative is kind of the way to go about that. And then also developing key organizational KPIs that go off of that. So at the beginning of every communications campaign, right, it should always start with research. And that's absolutely should contain kind of a KPI setting exercise at the beginning. So what are some of those like key performance indicators that we can identify from the outset that represent both measurable, quantifiable, and qualitative factors?
Great. Thank you so much for answering that. Let's see. The next one that came in is, with a limited ad budget, what are the most effective strategies to ensure that a campaign is making a difference?
Awesome. I'll jump in on that one, Melissa. This is a question that we get a lot, and I really love it because everyone wants, everyone in the world to see their campaign's message. But I think working in public affairs, we know that budgets are limited, timelines are limited, and we have to make strategic decisions on who to reach with a campaign right from the very beginning. So the way that we like to craft our successful campaigns, right, is really thinking through who are the primary audiences. As Bryce mentioned, that begins with research, right? So that can be research into who are the influencers who are driving the narrative around a conversation. Oftentimes, we may approach a new problem thinking that we know who the people are who are driving that message. And through the research and through the analytics, we actually uncover additional voices that we didn't expect. So I think sometimes checking those assumptions at the door and letting the research run its course is really, really important. I can't tell you the number of times that we think that, oh, it's just this one reporter that's carrying the message and we just need to reach this one person. But we uncover through social listening, through manual research sometimes, that actually, and this is an example from a recent campaign, there's actually a lively conversation happening on a Reddit subforum, right? A subreddit talking about this issue. And there are certain people on there who carry outsized weight and outsized influence. Based on that, what we would say is, well, Reddit may be a platform that we recommend for digital advertising, right? Promoting that post in addition to other strategies to engage there. So it's really kind of who is the audience, basing that in the research. Which platforms is that target audience on? I just gave sort of the Reddit example, but oftentimes we're running, beltway-based campaigns. We're trying to reach influencers on the hill. We're trying to reach people who are always online, right? And so we need to reach them where they are, whether that's X, formerly Twitter, whether that's listening to podcasts and doing advertising on platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We're going to identify where our audience is on those platforms. And then sort of, I think the third step is, how are you reaching that audience on those platforms? What does that creative look like that carries the message? And that can mean a number of different things, right? That can be as simple as a post that goes up on social media. That can be a short video. That can be a large narrative story and a campaign that has multiple voices over a large period of time. The advantage, and I'll wrap up the answer here, but kind of the advantage of beginning with audience and research is that then you can measure the success in in reaching that group and in moving that group. And that can help to demonstrate that that ad budget was an effective way to move that target audience.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind the audience that you can submit questions in two ways. You can either put them into the chat or into the Q&A module. So either way, they'll get to us. And in the Q&A module, you do have the chance to upvote. So if you are really wanting to get that question answered, everyone else can upvote it and we will answer those first. So, all right, let's see. What's our next question? Programmatic advertising seems like a black box. How are you able to measure the ROI of a display ad campaign?
I can answer this one. So our approach really to digital advertising, especially programmatic advertising, is demystifying the campaign. There's value in sometimes running broadly targeted campaigns, but seeing the people that you want to focus on requires a more targeted approach. And often people see results that just speak about impressions or reach, and those numbers don't really show the people that you want to reach, and they don't really give the picture of moving the needle among those people. So our approach is typically to start with identifying the audience. That first step really is knowing the people that you want to see the message. Once we have, whether it's the key decision makers or influencers in the space that we want as part of our audience, we move on to developing the messages and looking into how different messages may impact different segments of that audience. Once we have our message and our audience, we then reach those people at a high frequency by putting that message in front of them across the internet, regardless of where they may be, looking at websites to find a recipe or looking at the news. We want to make sure they're seeing our message. And by really showing that we're getting that message in front of the right people is the way to know if you're really making a difference in the audience that you want to reach. And it really gives the confidence that people you want seeing the content are the people you're reaching. The return on investment is clear that if you can engage that audience with your message, you're making a difference. If we also do a lot of tests from there. So if we have a message, we have our audience and people aren't engaging, we know we need to shift tactics and maybe try a different approach. And we do a lot of testing and we're able to see really what works with certain people and what doesn't, and hone in on the messaging that moves the needle.
Great, thank you. Let's see, what is our next question? Where do you get started in building an effective relationships with third parties for a public affairs campaign?
I can take this one. I think that's a really great question. And I think for anyone starting to build out a public affairs campaign, building a strong third-party network can seem really daunting. There's so many different groups and organizations in the space. So I think starting this process always helps with building a really strong landscape assessment. That kind of feeds into what Chris was saying about doing the manual research of who's been saying what about the issue that you care about. So identifying what groups and third parties have publicly spoken about the issues that you care about or the end game of your campaign, and starting to reach out to build a relationship with those groups who are supportive of your policy priorities or who could be educated or persuaded to be supportive of your policy priorities is always really helpful. And I think building that strong landscape also helps identify who might be detractors in your space. So when you're in the thick of a campaign, you see groups who are posting on social or publishing op-eds or other earned media tactics, and you'll already know who the groups are and what their affiliation is and what their policy priorities are. You also want to make sure that you're building relationships with groups that are diverse or because different groups will resonate differently with lawmakers or regulators or whoever the targets for your campaign are. So for one example, I recently worked on a healthcare related campaign. We worked with 3 different third-party groups, one being a life sciences trade association, one being a patient group, another being the mom of a patient. So each of those groups have a different perspective that they can offer to lawmakers, and that's going to resonate differently with different lawmakers across the aisle. And then all 3 of them have this different perspective that all feed into the end goal of the campaign. So the trade association can speak to how this certain bill will impact jobs and local businesses across the state. The patient group can speak to how this will affect patients across the state. And then the mom of the patient can really speak to her personal experience and her personal testimony. And I think when looking to, strengthen relationships with third-party groups, it's really helpful to have semi-regular touch points with them. And I think depending on how broad or how narrow your campaign is going to be, there might be an opportunity to educate groups on specific nuances of what you're trying to accomplish. So if you're trying to build support around a certain bill that's moving through Congress, and I think not every group's going to have kind of the background knowledge of what that bill is or what the landscape looks like around it. So setting up time to talk through those details with them and really help them, understand what you're looking to accomplish positions you as a resource for them to come back to in the future, and might be more willing to work with. And I think just going forward, as you're building relationships with third-party groups, just making sure you're setting up time to talk to them on the phone and talk about what your internal priorities are, what their priorities are, what they've been working on, and just staying in touch down the line, whether that's sharing new stories, new studies, reports that come out, attending their events, and just really being in touch of what they have going on helps build a stronger relationship. I think when third-party groups can see that you and your team care about and are invested in their success and want to maintain that relationship and putting the effort to do so, it's much easier to build trust and they're more likely to engage with you down the line.
Those are great points. Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Okay, so let's see what's next. We have, when you don't have as many campaigns going on, what are some of the ways a PR government affairs team might show ROI?
I think we all may have some answers to that, but I think actually the points that Khadija was just making helps to begin to answer this question, right? So building those relationships with third-party groups and groups in different sectors, different voices, because sometimes, as Khadija just talked about, it takes time to build those relationships and establishing that trust, and then moving from the relationship to the content that we may want to create, whether that's an op-ed, whether that's a video and a video testimonial, or a story-based campaign that's told interactively. We all know how much lead time those projects take. And I think if we can kind of trace that back to showing the importance of being prepared for whatever may come in a campaign, that helps to demonstrate the ROI when you're not in that sprint moment. From a digital acquisition perspective, which is building your list of advocates and having a diverse list, we like the moments when there's not a lot of action going on, because it helps you to test different strategies to build that list, right? So maybe it's an audience that you always wanted to see if they were to engage in your with your organization, and adding that as an audience on Facebook, or maybe that's a new platform for acquisition and engagement that we've wanted to test out. So I think there are lots of ways to think of those down periods as test opportunities and moments to anticipate and build for fights to come.
I totally agree. And just putting in the time to build the relationships in the more slower periods just pays dividends when you're getting into big pushes around legislative bills or when you're in session in a specific state. I think those are the times where you can really cultivate your messaging and then build a relationship with third parties so you can come back to them at a more hectic time where you need something done in the next 2 weeks or 1 week or something like that.
It's also a really great time for community management, not just through like evergreen content, but building up on that grassroots level as well. Again, all kind of with this proactive nature in mind, coming specifically from more of like a research perspective, and thinking about it from like a media monitoring lens. If nothing's going on, sometimes that's when I'm the most afraid, because I don't know what's going on. It's sometimes just like a black hole out there, right? So I think keeping like a very consistent monitoring and listening program in place in these moments is super important, so you can know where threats come in on. Crises often come in on vectors we can predict and understand. So whether that's getting like an early warning of when a new issue is coming down the road, we can get an alert for that. So I think in tandem kind of with what Chris and Khadija were saying, building up that community, having all of these proactive third-party relationships can really help mitigate some of that later down the line. And then having really like all these early warning signals turned on and be monitoring and listening for those in the landscape.
Yeah, and I'll add to that anytime there's a downtime, that's, as Chris mentioned, it's a great time to keep testing different messages. And what that does is really, it helps you create a drip effect of making sure that you're reaching the audiences in a way that they're primed to engage with the content when the right moment strikes. So if you put your message in front of them, they're more likely to be engaging with them. They're likely to have more education on it. So you're not starting at the first drop one of explaining what the issue is. They have a little bit of education, understand what it is. So that way, when the moment comes, you're able to really engage the audience at a higher level and at a higher bar to move the needle or meet your goals during a crisis moment.
Those are really great points. Thank you, guys. Okay, let's see. The next question is, we all know constituent voices are effective when engaging lawmakers, but how can we scale this tactic? When you're building a grass tops recruitment effort, what tools have you used both in Quorum and through other software providers to collect voices and testimonials?
Yeah, I'll start here, and I'm sure everyone will want to weigh in also. This is a great question, and this is something that we're working on pretty much every day, is building a community of advocates, not just to take action, but to put their own personal story and face behind an issue. So some effective methods that we've seen for that is lowering the barrier to entry, right? Making it as easy as possible for someone to share their story. So maybe that is first as a response to a survey question. How do you feel about X, right? That's a really easy way for someone to answer. And then kind of ask them, oh, can you share us a little bit more, right? And then, if we record a short video message, right, that is going to be an impactful way. And applying some tactics from political campaigns. I know Hina and I come from a political background. And we like to think sometimes around how to get people to do things, like getting someone to register and eventually to vote, right? It's walking them up a ladder of engagement. It's applying some tactics like social pressure, like saying, we have 20 stories from advocates like you in your state. Will you join in, right? Will you add your voice to the number of neighbors in your community who have also said that this issue is important to them? And I think the second part of this message, right, that or the second part of this question, using technology and using tools like Quorum can be really helpful for that, right? Both in lowering those barriers, but also in tracking all of the data from advocates who are taking action and segmenting those advocates according to what actions that they have taken. When you're running these integrated campaigns, there's a lot of data coming in. There's a lot of different components. And what Quorum and other software tools do so well is help to organize that information, right? So we know which advocates are the most primed for outreach, the folks that we need to prioritize reaching out to today, and then who are the low-hanging fruit that we need to come back to tomorrow and maybe resend our messages to. I don't know if others have thoughts here on stories. Hina, I know you've run campaigns that have collected stories and put these up to target lawmakers in DC.
Yeah, so one key thing really is about knowing how to communicate with people and engage them on the issue that we're trying to ask them the questions about. So that can mean, sharing a story from other advocates. So you're empowering advocates to share their own when they see that people like them have gone through the same thing and they feel a connection to the original story and they're more likely to share their own. And developing surveys, that kind of thing, to make them feel comfortable about sharing their story, because these are very personal and we want to make sure that people feel heard and empowered when they speak up. And then to the second point about the tools, so we use tools like Quorum to really make sure that those stories that we're collecting by advocates are heard by their members. So we're able to use, like I said, Quorum and other digital tools to really match up those stories with the advocates with lawmakers who would know that those are their constituents, to really make a difference. Because someone from Massachusetts hearing about someone in their district share how a certain program has really benefited them is going to have a much stronger impact than the member from Congress hearing from someone in California share their story. So it really creates a deeper impact and builds more of that pressure point for members of Congress when they know that these are their own constituents who care about the issue. They're speaking up, they're sharing their voices, and we're just able to make sure that we are there to elevate those voices for them.
When we talk about scaling up advocacy tactics and using a suite of tools at once, like in Quorum, my number one concern is data hygiene. When we have so many data points coming in from all these different perspectives, how can we streamline that into the most effective manner possible? I personally believe the best insights come when we're being data source agnostic, when we're able to identify all these individual metadata points attached to each individual advocate, kind of no matter where those metadata points come from. So I think having a very strong form of like a BI plan in place is going to be super important, right? Thinking about what business intelligence workflows we can include into our everyday reality. And so I think oftentimes in PR, in government affairs, sometimes we can feel like we work in a vacuum that way, but getting in contact with marketing teams where needed, really just making an organization-wide effort really to have good data hygiene across the organization. You'll know what data points from your advocacy efforts could impact more like go-to-market efforts or vice versa. So really having a strong BI plan in place to address all of those potential hygiene issues, I think is super important as we talk about scaling up some of these efforts.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just want to add one thing on the power of story and sharing that among all of the different teams or departments, right, that are working on a campaign. So we've made it a point to, if we're working with different partners or maybe external lobbyists or other consultants who are part of a campaign, to set up shared trackers, right, where we say these are the number of stories that we've collected from this district, right, from those states, kind of arming everyone who is on your team with this information and not keeping it just siloed to the folks who may be managing like an email program or a social program. And sometimes it's a seemingly really simple thing, but it makes a big difference when someone's going in to speak with a staff member in their legislative office, in the district or on the Hill, right? To say like, you know, over the last 6 months, we've collected 15 stories from your constituents. And I know Quorum is able to sort of package that up really nicely so that whoever is in that meeting, if it's a lobbyist or if it's a constituent meeting, can come with that information, can come with those stories. So I think that's one of the other aspects that we've learned in running these campaigns.
Great, thank you guys. I just want to remind the audience, you've got an expert team here, so please do put your questions into the Q&A or the chat and take advantage of the people who are in the room. All right, so I just want to remind everybody. So for our next question, it might be outside your scope of work if your team works strictly with federal. Any insights about differences in approach to measuring ROI of a campaign for state level audiences as opposed to the federal level?
You know, you work with a lot of state campaigns, right?
Yeah, so I can take this one. I know Khadija and I work on a lot of state campaigns together, so I'm sure she has more to add as well. So there are differences and there are a lot of similarities as well. So on some of the similarities being on a state level, it is the lawmakers that we're targeting. It's the lawmakers that we want to really communicate with and get our message in front of. And whether there's a bill that passes or not, the process often is it's similar to how the campaigns are at a federal level. A difference between the state and federal campaigns, however, is that there are the level of resources. So as you're communicating with people at lawmakers at a state level, it's going to be a little bit different. And getting people to really engage with the messages that they may not have as many resources to put towards. So that's one of the challenges with federal versus state level campaigning. And then also when it comes to state level, we really often focus on the issues that are very local to the people there. So if it's reporters, lobbyists, whoever it may be, we localize the issue rather than talking about it at a higher scale, and making it not only strictly based on that state, but also sometimes the county level, or even city level, to make sure that we're reaching both state lawmakers with the messages, but also other key decision makers around them.
Yeah, and I think to add on that, state level campaigns often move, I think, a little bit quicker than federal campaigns, especially when states are in session. Those are often like 45, 60, or 100 days. So you have that short amount of window to get your policy party done for the year before the state goes out of session, and the legislator is looking at hundreds of bills that session. So you really have a short amount of time to make a really big impact in the state. So I think just going on that, it's really helpful to know what your goals are going into session for the year. So if session kicks off the first week of January, using Q4 the year before to really hone in on your messaging, get all your ducks in a row, know who your third parties you are going to work with, have your messaging right, have your ads right, maybe run ads before session starts to help priming lawmakers to see that they see who your group is and be more familiar with their language really helps. Because once you're in the thick of session, things move so quickly. It's often hard to make your voice heard and make an impact.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so let's see. What is our next question? It's kind of like roulette. I love it. Okay, so when running a grassroots campaign, do you aim for a specific number of constituent letters or calls to reach federal legislators in order to move the needle? Obviously, each Hill office is different, but was wondering if there's a benchmark that you typically look for in order to have impact.
Yeah, so I can start this off, and I'm sure others will want to add to this one. So on a federal campaign, there are, depends on who the lawmakers are, like you mentioned, but also if it's senators or House members, because the size of the office is different. And the work that we've done, we know that there's a different number that makes an impact. So for example, when it comes to driving phone calls at for Senate office, we like to aim for anywhere from around 90 phone calls a day on a particular issue. And on those phone calls, it's not just about the volume, but it's also about the message. So we like to make sure that we are educating advocates on how to communicate the issue and really share their voice, and when they're talking to their members and making these phone calls. And we like to make sure that the members know that these are their constituents, and they're people who may be voting for them, to really apply that extra level of pressure that may be needed. So as I mentioned, for Senate, we typically aim for around 90 a day. And then for House, around 40 to 45 phone calls a day. And then similarly for when it comes to letters, it's around, the numbers aren't as drastic, but we like to aim for a few thousands per campaign for any driven issue.
And what I would add to that, and this is the beauty of running an integrated campaign, is we want to think about when those constituent communications are hitting, right? So is it more of a inside campaign where we know that the legislation is or the policy is being written, and that's something that may not be in the news, but that the office is working on and driving our communications to hit at those moments? Or is it an issue that we really want to flood the office with and almost shut down the office, right? Like have so many phone calls that the phones are ringing off the hook to start or stop our policy, right? And kind of timing out when that best moment is. And we found the best success in having these constituent communications is aligning that with other activities. So maybe we're driving a lot of calls the same week that we're having a fly-in with members coming to the Capitol Hill office, right? And so they walk in and they're like, oh, we've been getting a lot of calls on this issue, the staff will say, in addition to the work that we're doing with digital advertising, right, to target those specific members and those staff. So they're seeing our ads, they're hearing constituents on the phones, and then they walk into the office at the same time that a third party has published a letter to the editor in the local newspaper, right? And trying to bring all of this together at the right time. That's obviously the sweet spot, and that's the ideal campaign is when that happens. But I think those are some of the variables and some of the strategy that we would be wanting to make sure is part of our plan for executing and winning a campaign.
I'll also add that using constituents as a lever to try and influence members of Congress is one way to go about influence, right? It's a very bottom-up grassroots level. Another way we do it at Rational is looking at who is influential to members of Congress. So looking at social media, who do they follow online? When we talk about that method, right, it's a lot of different magic numbers in mind. So like typically for a delegation, we would want to identify the top 250 influencers influential, right, to these members of Congress. That can include journalists they follow online, other third-party groups, other think tanks, maybe even other members of Congress. Like, who are the top 250 influencers influential to either like a delegation or a specific congressional office? That's more of like a top-down perspective. But again, all these different levers to influence members of Congress, each kind of with their own discrete value, sometimes dependent on the issue, but a lot of different ways to answer that, but just pointing out that there's that like top-down way as well.
Yeah. I'll add one more thing, and just as important as it is to pressure a member kind of before an issue, it's saying thank you, right, to members who act the way that we want them to do. And sometimes allocating some of a campaign budget and resources to driving constituents to say thank you and putting those points on the board and that on the tally sheet right after a key vote or after a campaign pays dividends for the next fight, because we all know there's always a next time, right? There's always a next step.
There is always a next time. It's a good point. Okay. Let's see. When it comes to having meetings with legislators, state or federal level, do you find leaving handouts is effective? If yes, do you find that shorter, quicker handouts are better, or longer, more detail-oriented ones are better?
I'll dive in on this one. So the classic leave behind is still a really important resource, right? But what we have found is if you can have more of a visual on the leave behind, so a document that maybe presents data with an engaging infographic or using some data visualization, and then contains either a link or an easy QR code that goes back to resources on your organization's website or additional policy that can sort of serve the multiple audiences. It's great to have that leave behind, though, because you know someone has it in their hand and they're going to go walk back to their desk and put it down there. And eventually they're going to look at it again and they're going to be like, oh, I remember that meeting, or I need to follow up on that. So if only for having that trigger for that follow up and for the recall, it's really important. We know some staffers like having the more detailed information, but we also know as advocates working on campaigns, sometimes those nuances and even that messaging can change over the course of a campaign. So to thread that needle, right, like having that QR code again that goes back to the website, the website then could be updated, right, if the campaign changes over time. So just some things to think about for creating these resources.
And one more thing I'll add to that is, as we're talking about stories and telling advocate stories earlier, and sometimes having a kind of leave behind one pager is also a place where you can add those kind of stories. So in addition to, as Chris mentioned, having an infographic style one pager that really visually lays out what you want the members to see, having that, but in addition to that, just having advocate stories come from their own constituents is also powerful. And those are something that, it's not going to change. You're going to want that message in front of them. So it's always good to think about the things that, regardless of how maybe legislation may change, what you would want to remain constant is what you put on that one pager, because unlike a website or something, the digital space, that one pager won't change. So having constituent stories that are powerful, it's great to put that right in front of the members by putting it on a one pager. Having an infographic style data is going to be impactful as well.
Yeah, and I think going beyond meetings with legislators, these handouts can often be helpful resources if you're trying to engage with reporters or other members of the media and trying to explain a really complicated or nuanced issue in an easy to understand way. So for an issue that's maybe harder for the average person to understand, it's a great resource to share with a reporter at your local newspaper who wants to learn more and who might be interested in writing about your story or your issue, and something that they can, refer back to when they're, writing their story or wanting to cover your issue.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really insightful. Let's see. Our next question. What are some of your preferred methods or tools for digital marketing that help recruit new grassroots advocates? Who wants to take that one?
I can give an initial shot and let the rest of the team kind of fill in the gaps here. There's a lot of different methods we could use. So what my team focuses on is looking at who's kind of already talking about some of our issues in the online ecosystem. I think we are at way more of an advantage now to do this than we were 20 years ago, right? We're able to actually have social media as a resource, have different online forums as a resource, all to kind of gauge audience segments who could be relevant for this. So once we are able to kind of identify a specific audience segment, maybe by what they're talking about online, we're able to identify some of those key demographics involved in that audience segment, find a lot of lookalike groups for that audience, and then make these strategic recommendations about how we should target either those lookalike groups or kind of those core audience segments we know who are already talking about our issues for grassroots acquisition. A lot of it can also be more like psychographic and demographic based. I know our ads team has a lot of different tools like that at our disposal there, but using just kind of open source, publicly available data shouldn't be underestimated in acquisition efforts either.
Yeah. Meta is still where we're finding, the most cost-effective way to acquire a grassroots advocate. That shouldn't come as a surprise to a lot of the folks in the digital space who are tuning in. However, I think what we have seen and where we're experimenting the most and really looking to the future, right, is how acquiring new supporters, not through the organization's voice, but by other voices, right? So third-party content creators and influencers, that's really where we're seeing messages travel faster and platforms prioritizing those voices over organization accounts, and especially organizations more in the political and advocacy space. So what we have found is, if a content creator posts their own 15-second video on a social media platform and includes a link to get people to sign up for a website or take action on a petition or fill out a survey, we're seeing comparable engagement rates to running a traditional click to sign up ad on Meta, right? So I would throw that out there as something definitely to be testing here, and what we're seeing as we look to what is the future of digital acquisition and digital marketing to build our grassroots advocacy base look like.
And one more thing I'll add to that is kind of a method that we know works really well is often really helping simplify complex issues for our advocates, because people are busy with their lives. There's a lot going on and there's a lot of noise on the internet. And we want to make sure that our advocates have their time is being used effectively, and really simplifying the issue and doing it through platforms that they're most likely to use. So with whether that's through Meta, through partnership with other influencers in the space, or sometimes just reaching them directly through kind of peer-to-peer texting, which is a great way. As we know, people are likely to always open their text messages. And it's a communication method that kind of takes away the formality of communication, and you can have a conversation with the advocates you're trying to reach and having them to explain the issue and have them opt in to receive more information is also an effective way, and we see great return on during an advocate base through tools like that.
This is an amazing discussion. Thank you, guys. I just want to remind the audience, we are nearing the end of our Q&A. So if you have questions, please submit them now. All right, so on to the next one. Blake writes, do letters and phone calls actually work? If so, how do you communicate to your advocates that their grassroots efforts are actually making a difference? We hear a certain amount of skepticism from our advocates regarding whether letters and phone calls actually work versus thinking that the only thing that matters today is the behind the scenes politicking. In other words, people are really skeptical that their voices are actually heard. And how do you address this?
I'll start here because I think, there is generally a skepticism among some folks when they see social media communications, or they get an email from a group, they're getting inundated, they want to know if it actually works, right? So we've addressed this a couple of ways with different campaigns that we've worked on. One, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, but using advocate voices themselves to encourage other people to take action, right? So showing someone actually making that phone call or sending that letter, and showing how easy it is and showing why they felt the importance of making their voice heard. So that's kind of beginning at the grassroots level, using advocates to inspire other advocates. There's an element of some social pressure, right? We've received these number of letters from your state, will you join in? Or your state's falling behind, and kind of visualizing the impact of all constituents making their voices heard. So we do a lot of work with maps, putting maps together to show the number of letters, number of phone calls that come in from each state, and even each congressional district, really kind of mapping the impact of what one voice looks like, and then collectively what that impact is. And then all the way up, right? And this seemed like an obvious thing, but it actually made a big difference to have the president and CEO of one of our campaigns that we've worked on actually explain himself, right, in his own words, why this advocacy matters and why it was important to have members of Congress. And it was an easy ask to make, and it actually made a difference, right? So thinking through kind of all of those levers within your organization to encourage that support. I'm probably missing some aspects of others have things, but I think this is a great question, and it's definitely something that we're also seeing, and that we're working through from a number of creative angles.
Yeah, and this really is a great question, and something that we also see, and we also know the other side of it, where campaigns that we worked on, we've directly then heard from members that, they heard the stories from their constituents, or they got a certain number of letters, calls, that kind of thing, where they've spoken to other people on the ground and said, like, this really made a difference. And when those kind of moments happen, we like to really share that with the advocates, so they feel involved in the process and understand kind of how the messages that they sent and how impactful they were. So we are able to see that and know that members are hearing what advocates are reaching out to them about, and it does make an impact when you get a certain volume of messages in front of them, and once you've heard it directly from them, really shows how powerful it can be.
Yeah, and exactly, and communicating wins back to your advocates, right? We talked about there's always kind of a next chapter for a campaign, so making sure that they know that when their voice matters, that it actually did make a difference, right? I think including that in those communications equally important.
Anecdotally, it's a lot easier in an election year The media landscape is already so preconditioned with get out the vote messaging, your voice matters messaging, to where I think it just kind of has like a natural preconditioning. So that's something I see a lot when I'm kind of analyzing the media landscape, is that kind of as we approach like kind of whatever the next big election cycle is, there's always a bit more of an uptick. But maybe it's like framed in the context of the specific election, or probably factors that I can't see that are more like influencing the subconscious of voters, right? Just that their voice, in fact, does matter.
It's a great question and some good answers there. All right. So what are the best social listening resources that you've seen?
I can feel this. There are a lot out there. Some of the bigger tools include like Brandwatch, Miltwater, Talkwalker, Quid. It's all about kind of finding what the right tool stack looks like for you. And there's a lot of different ways we can kind of go about that. The fact of the matter is all these tools at the end of the day, they are all measuring the same open source, publicly available data that exists on social media. Everybody is kind of playing from the same playing field in that perspective. I think in that vein, lots of times social media data can be competitively neutral. So we need to find new ways to analyze that. So some of that comes in the form of AI. Kind of how can AI help us gain an advantage using large language models and natural language processing to get to the heart of key insights on social. I think another part of it is just kind of in analytical processes themselves. I'm a big fan of looking for ambiguities in social media. So kind of no matter the tool you're on, I'm a big believer that ambiguity creates opportunity. And that's kind of how you're able to go beyond that competitively neutral perspective by seeing what is the outlier in an online conversation. Maybe this is unclear. Let's dive into that further. Let's go the extra click on kind of this issue. And so kind of a combination of all those factors. Looking for those ambiguities, looking for those outliers makes such a big difference, because kind of no matter the social listening resource you have at your disposal, everybody's looking at the same information anyways. So being able to analyze that just at a higher level, I think is super important.
In terms of products, to bring us back to demonstrating the ROI of a campaign, kind of two social listening products that we have really found success in is one is showing an organization or a campaign share a voice at the beginning of a campaign and at the end, right? And hopefully showing that increase in overall volume and overall engagement in the conversation, and where that organization ranks, right? And so using all of the tools that Bryce just talked about to bring it back to sort of show that impact, to demonstrate that impact, and to quantify it using data. And I think the second product here is, for all of the issues that we work on, trying to establish a benchmark, a peer-based benchmark of other organizations, other companies, other issue groups in the space. Where do you rank? And then how is your content or how is your creative performing against that benchmark? So we do a lot of using tools to develop that custom, unique kind of benchmark, and then judging the success of our campaigns based on that.
Context forms an insight. That's why that baseline Chris just mentioned is so important. We can't really have an insight and make actionable decisions if we don't have context to compare all these measurements to. So absolutely, having some of these like baselines and using a good kind of quantitative methodology to base that in is super important.
Okay, well, we are nearing the end of our time, so I don't want to go over. I want to be cognizant of everyone's day. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our speakers for lending their expertise. As a reminder, we will distribute the video in the next day or two, so do keep an eye out. And if you'd like to learn more about Rational 360, check out the Docs tab over by the chat to learn more. There's quite a few things in there, so it'll keep you very busy for a while. And thank you everyone again for attending. Have a wonderful day.